So a little bit of kind of icebreakers to get things started. If you've already seen some of these slides, if you've attended other events that we've put on elsewhere virtually, you might know the answers to some of these questions. But I think this is an interesting exercise to kind of warm us up to what we're talking about today. What do you guys think the highest paying job in IT security is? Is it the Chief Information Security Officer, CISO, lead software engineer, cybersecurity sales engineer, or the cybersecurity architect? These are just some examples of some well-paying positions in the space. Looks like it's the CISO, right? It's not. Cybercrime is the highest paying job. It's one thing that people don't often consider when you think of it this way. So just kind of reframing that, if that's the highest paying job, the rest of us have to do a really good job of protecting things, because people are stealing this data and reselling it on the dark web. All of this activity is completely criminal. It's bootleg, it's illegal. There's nothing kosher about it at all. Some of this stuff is encrypting data and ransoming it to companies to decrypt it. Some of us have seen that stuff in the news or maybe been exposed to it. Bank accounts are being hacked and there's fraudulent transfers happening. So excited to have Penny on the panel to talk to some of that stuff. But in a day, a cyber hack, if you will, can go from an idea to millions of dollars inside of one single day, and almost at like no cost. So there's groups out there like the Russian Business Network, the Karbana group, Casa Nostra, some other places that I can't like really pronounce that well, Yakuza, the Sinaloa drug cartel. These are really well-funded organizations. This is organized crime at a large level. They're stealing data and hacking accounts at 2 petabytes a day, worth $10 million each, with almost zero cost. So, when these operations go all the way from idea to millions inside of one day, it's scary, right? It's a big business, and you see it in the headlines. We all might recall the Colonial Pipeline incident that happened earlier this year. They paid roughly $5 million to hackers in ransomware. It's wreaking havoc on U.S. cities. These are just headlines that I'm grabbing that I could plaster this on here and make it look like doomsday, But the reality of what cybercrime looks like, when I'm doing a lot of these searches, putting these things together, you see the hacker with the hoodie on and the matrix data points in the background. That's pretty cheesy, but what's really going on, it looks like a call center. They have a help desk, and they will help you set up a Bitcoin account. And if they do a good job and they work with you, they'll ask you for a rating and a review, so that if you get approached by one of these companies and you've been hacked, you'll know if you can negotiate a deal with them. So it's not like what you would think. It's not that hacker in the basement, right? But to kind of round this out a little bit, even the Colonial Pipeline incident that happened, when you dig into it, it was compromised. It was a compromised password that had that leak come in. And at the end of the day, that's something that us, as the human firewall, so to speak, that we can do to kind of improve our own cybersecurity posture. So with that being said, one of the reasons we're putting this event on is, it's Cybersecurity Awareness Month. It's October. And for those that aren't familiar with what that is, it was launched by the National Cybersecurity Alliance and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security back in 2004. So incidentally enough, the same year SWICKtech was founded, this kind of event or awareness was kind of put on, this collaborative effort between the government to ensure that every American has the resources they need to stay safe and more secure online. So that extends to just end consumers, but businesses alike. So our panelists today, we are missing one. He wasn't able to attend. Phil Proctor is not on the panel today, unfortunately. But I think the folks that we do have can still speak to some of that stuff on the insurance side of things. So we have Jim Tenmer, if you want to wave. There's Jim. And then we have Isaac Montegudo, our CEO, and Matt Lee, and April DeVulcanair, and Penny. There we go. So what we're doing today is we're going to be asking these folks a number of questions that are related to cybersecurity, as you are obviously all aware. So with that said, the first kind of line of questions are going to be general, and I encourage everybody to take an at-bat at answering some of these questions from your perspective. And then the next round of questions will be more specific to your niche or industry, okay? So, yeah. And then at the end, obviously, we'll do a full Q&A from the audience. But again, I encourage questions. So if something sparks a thought or something like that, feel free to raise your hand. But I'll let whoever wants to grab this one first. What do you see as the largest cyber threat to businesses in the Midwest? And there's 2 mics at the table. You have to flip it on, hold it close. And whoever wants to grab the first question, jump in. Like a game show?
So I think the largest challenge, Midwest or otherwise, I don't think it's necessarily geographically limited, but it certainly applies here too, is you have a giant gap between what is necessary to protect ourselves, hearts and minds, decisions, processes, policies, the way we function, what we choose to do as a company, and a gap between that and the knowledge and necessary to do that. And so most people are still in this state of saying, it won't happen to me, I don't need to do those things, I don't want to take away admin rights from my people because it's annoying to them, it's inconvenient. And so there's this giant gap, and all I have to do as a threat actor is take advantage of that, right? Simple things that you can do to protect yourself often are somewhat inconvenient. And so we still have this convenience over security problem. And so part of what I live to do and what I've heard from this team loves to do is educate. There's an education gap in cybersecurity, right? We have to function as a team. Security can't happen in a vacuum. And so for me, I think it's this education gap in most companies to commit to the things necessary to protect themselves often. So you were next.
I think from the banking aspect of it, which I represent and see most often, is we're excited to see the companies that we're working with now building some of those policies and procedures and paying attention to that. But in addition to that education factor that you mentioned, we have to do the testing. We have to test those policies and procedures, and we have to test our employees. Because when I go and meet with customers and we're implementing payment solutions, helping business customers with those payment solutions, and it's amazing to me, they'll have great IT resources available, but yet to your point, the admin rights are there. I'm working with a banking user that has full admin rights, and I can download a hardware piece, a check scanner, me, the bank, right on that individual's PC, and they have all access to banking credentials. That scares me tremendously, but here they have all these great IT resources, and if you read their policies that are being written and put in place, they're strong, but they're actually not in place.
They're pseudo-policies.
It's a great on a piece of paper, and it probably meets some audit requirement when you submit it, but if it's not tested, you haven't done yourself any good. And you can't just test it once. You have to continue to do not just the education piece that was mentioned, but that testing piece has to be done continually and ongoing, and I would even suggest that once a year isn't enough. So that's kind of my take on, you have to educate, but then you also have to test based on those policies and procedures written.
In regards to the policies and procedures, we also look at that from an aspect from a prosecutorial standpoint, in that sometimes it's an employee who's intentionally letting these people in based on their administrative rights because they have some other type of issue. Maybe they have an addiction or they have something else where they need funding, and so they're being paid off. And so part of in regards to the different aspects in the policies is making sure that your employees are not only aware of them, that you're testing them, but you're actually making them sign off on those policies every time you update them, okay? Or, yes, right, anytime they change a position or something to that effect, because they may now have new responsibilities or new regulations that they have to abide by. And part of that is in regards to your HR records is making sure you know, okay, they were covered under this policy from this date to this date, the new policy from this date to this date. That really becomes important when it comes to our aspect of investigation later on.
Pass the mic to Isaac, Matt.
Well, what we see at the Better Business Bureau is fear. A lot of fear from businesses in that they think they can't keep up. There's new scams every day. There's new cybersecurity threats every day, and they don't have the resources. They don't have an IT person. They might not even contract with an IT company. And we're talking small businesses, and they just don't know what to do. And it's probably like my grandma when she went to the mechanic, and he said, well, you need this and you need this. And she just went, okay, where's my wallet? And I think you have a lot of businesses in that same sense of they don't even understand the problem, like you said, education, let alone understanding what to do about the problem. And when we talk about employees, turnover is at an all-time high for employees. You bring them in, they leave. You bring them in, they leave. You bring them in, they leave. How do you train them up? How do you get them, if you do just test once a year, you may have 3 employees come and go before that year is up. And you can have the best security system in the world, and if you have an employee that goes around it intentionally or unintentionally, it's not worth anything. So it's the idea of kind of raising the awareness of people of what this is, just so they can talk about it logically with people, other people, and then you can start building solutions. But I find so many people just kind of like, they don't think it's going to happen to them, they shut off, and it does happen. And to small businesses, I can talk later about the business email compromise scam, but I was out in La Crosse. Guy worked for a very small business, and he was the president of the business, and he was just walking through the hallway, and he met the office manager, and she said, "Oh, I took care of that change for you with your new account." He said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Well, you sent me that email that you're changing your direct deposit because you opened a new bank account." He said, "I never sent you that email." And this is a small, maybe 10-person business in La Crosse. So, I mean, this can happen to anybody, anywhere, and we don't need to be afraid. We need to understand and take action.
So I think that the biggest cyber threat continues to be ransomware and scams, right? Like that's accelerating in some places and moving out of just business email compromise into other systems such as industrial systems, automation systems, building automation systems, social media. The bad guys are getting smarter and finding more ways to get in. And so, obviously there's a whole defense and detection conversation to be had. But the Midwest is particularly vulnerable for the reasons that we're talking about here. We don't have as much technical talent as is needed right now, right? The demand for technical talent is larger than the amount of people that we have to fill it. So it's kind of a recipe for some problems. Being proactive is really the only choice.
It's a really strong summation of answers. Education, testing, enacting policies, and then the human side of it. We're talking about cybersecurity, and here we are hearing about all of this human behavior that goes on, and then the talent gap that might exist here in the Midwest, specifically from a tech standpoint. Those are really good answers, guys. Thank you. So can you give an example of a recent cyber incident that you worked with a business on? Jim, it sounds like you kind of had one that you encountered, but again, I encourage everyone to take a stab at this one. We'd love to hear from specific examples you might have.
I have a great one. So he brought this up, business email compromise, and I'm sure you see this every day. But one of the ones we see is this ABC compromise. And so it kind of shows how the threat actors think. And I don't like to use hackers because I'm a hacker. But threat actors is a hacker that takes that and uses it against you. And so what happens is company B was my client, right? So company B was the person that I'm coming from the lens of. But company A existed. They didn't have MFA on their mail. They didn't want it. It was inconvenient. So they were targeted. Someone spearphished them. It's just a term. I will use a few of them. I'll try to keep them down. But they spearphished them. They attacked a specific person in that organization. It was their AP and AR teams. And they got in. Well, once they got in, they started capturing email. They started just pulling email out, stuff with invoices, what people owed them on the AR side. And then they set up a sister domain. So if my company was ironscales.com, it would now be Elronscales because L looks just like an I, right? So it's a human delineation. So I set up Elronscales.com. I set it up so it's all delivering accurate mail. It's got SPF, all the protections necessary. It looks like good mail. It's going to make it through a spam filter. And so as you think about that, they reached out to company B because they knew company B owed them $500,000. And they said, "Hi, this is Sally. I need you to change our ACH instructions. We'd like you to pay on our new bank because it's COVID. We're not doing paper checks anymore. Please do this." And so company B wired $500,000 to company A, threat actor, right? And so the threat actor's conversation, they dragged the email into their email, so it's legitimately the continuation of that thread, right? And the people at company B followed all the controls. They reached out to their manager. The manager approved the change to ACH after calling the people on the phone number provided, right? So this gets into administrative controls. But as soon as the threat actor got money from company B, they then set up a sister domain for company B and started phishing company B. Company B also did not have MFA. They fought it. They didn't want to deal with it. It was too inconvenient. and they got in. Then they found company C. So if you think about company C got hit for another 400,000, you're out $1.4 million in the sense that you wired out 500 wrong, wired it out again to the right company, 500, as you're figuring this out. And they're trying to bring it back from the banks, but these people know the ACH timing so well that they get the money. And then they attack company C as a sister domain of company B. And so if you think about B squared and C squared, they probably made $20, $30 million in that time frame. And if you're a company that couldn't survive the cash flow delineation of $1.5 million, you just are in bad shape. And you're working to try to figure that out with the feds and the banks. But this was just probably 6 months ago, I guess, and so it was $1.5 million loss for them, or 1.4, I think it was. So.
Could they withstand it?
They did.
Okay.
There's still product out there from them.
So with this being said, from the banking perspective, depending upon what your role is for your company in this room, I highly encourage that if you're on the IT side, you go back and you need to engage the folks in your organization that are in charge of payment streams. Because all of these attacks, this is a cyber meeting, correct? A cybersecurity meeting. And I can tell you the ransomware increases for banking customers have increased tremendously. I would say in 2019, when we did some things with SWICKtech, I probably had maybe 2 customers, I believe, in 2019 that had ransomware. That I was aware of. So the scary part, too, is that I was aware of. We were talking earlier today, and April and I were discussing, it's amazing how many people have ransomware, and when you call those trusted partners, the bank wasn't on the list. The bank should be the first person on your list when you have any kind of cybersecurity attack, ransomware, business email compromise. How is the bank not on the list? It really should be the first call you make is to notify your financial institution, because what do you suppose they're trying to get at the end of the day? We're talking about change of direct deposits, payment streams, changing or manipulating that data. So from this particular question, ransomware is increasing tremendously in October. So I've worked on 17 ransomware cases for our business clients. And again, that I'm aware of. Right. I don't know what I'm not aware of, because oftentimes the bank doesn't make the list, and they have users that are logging in, sending payments, and you don't think that somebody's watching every movement. To the point that was made just a few minutes ago, they are, and they have been potentially for months. They know the behaviors. They know the company names. They know the information. So ransomware is huge, and I'm seeing it increasing tremendously. There's a lot of things regarding the ransomware that scares me. People are still making the payments. I understand why they are, and they need access to their data sooner than later because they don't have the right policies and procedures in place to get and back up that data in a timely fashion. It's one thing to have the recovery process in place, but if it takes them 2 weeks to recover and they don't have 2 weeks, that's a problem. It depends on the nature of the business and size, of course, and how far that system goes into, whether it's manufacturing or just a service industry. All of those things change. But ransomware we're seeing the most of. I probably see per day. And again, my client base, the clients that I work closely with, we're talking about 2,000 clients, not 200,000, not 2 million, but about 2,000 clients, about anywhere between 15 and 20 business email compromises coming in from our customers per day, where we're getting requests for wire transfers, requests for cashier's checks, requests to change data, requests to open accounts with real driver's license, real social security numbers, coming from these actors, not from our customers. And it's coming from our customer's email address. It's no longer that I missed an I that looks like an L or an O that looks like an A. It's coming from my customer's real email address. And because they're redirecting, it's really, really amazing what we're seeing. And this is per day on a very small client base on what I see every day. And it's not because my clients are ignorant. They look like every other mid-sized business in this country.
Well, I recently worked with a business, and when I say work, it's always afterwards when they contact us and they report things and they tell me what's going on. They had a ransomware attack, and I was talking to the business owner, and he said, I thought I did everything right. Our IT folks, we had multi-factor authentication, we had all this stuff going on. We didn't know how it happened. And then we found out it was one of our vendors. that one of their vendors was compromised, and the vendor had access to their database, and that's how they got in. So he thought he was doing everything right for his people. They were training, they had everything in place, but they didn't properly vet a vendor, and that caused them to go down too. So you can never be too careful. Anyone you let in, you better vet and make sure they're using the same policies and procedures that you are or more.
Just to follow up on that, and actually talking about a story we had discussed before we came up here, is really vetting your vendors. There was a case, thankfully not in our jurisdiction, but I assisted with it, is that a number, or probably 3 years ago or so, where a taxi cab company, and I know there's not a whole lot of them anymore, but there's, still Uber and Lyft, but they are still taxi cab companies. And those that have the swipe devices in their taxi cabs that you can use your card on, they didn't vet their vendor for the machines themselves. So there wasn't like an overlay, from a scammer specifically laid on the vendor. There was actually malware in the system network on the machines before they were even sent out. The company had no idea. They installed these in all of their automobiles. And from an example that Jim had experienced is essentially somebody gets into a taxi after you get off of a flight, you swipe your card so you can get to the hotel, and by the time you've made it through checkout and in your room, you've got your company calling you, why'd you spend $6,000 on concrete in California? That was actually his example. But essentially it's the same purpose. Like, you have no idea, and they are so quick to it because it's already on the device itself because the vendor wasn't vetted, that the company had no idea for an extended period of time, probably 18 months before they had enough complaints come in that they actually layered it back to where it was coming from, and it came back to the devices themselves, which were actually coming out of another country.
So one that we were recently involved with was a global company with a location here in Wisconsin, and they were going through the process of putting some cybersecurity software onto all their machines, but they weren't done with it yet. And in the midst of that, they had a ransomware attack that affected all their locations worldwide. And they found out that day that there were a number of dependencies that they really hadn't fully thought through. So their email system was still on premise, right? A lot of companies now have it in the cloud. And their phone systems were dependent on that email system. So they had to take their network down to deal with this ransomware incident, and they were not able to communicate with their customers or vendors in a reasonable way, right? They couldn't even get people's phone numbers because they weren't on their phones, this sort of thing. And to add insult to that injury, they also found out that day, and by the way, this is not a SWICKtech monthly client, they found out that their cybersecurity insurance had a ransomware waiver, meaning that ransomware was specifically excluded from their insurance policy. This is a pretty large company, so it can happen to anybody, even when you're trying to do the right things. They had some MFA efforts and what have you. It's very important to be looking at these things before a problem strikes.
Just a quick add-on to that. When you're talking about getting ready, making sure you're prepared in advance, if your cybersecurity policy is only on your computer, that's a huge problem. You need to have a physical printed copy in someone's office so that you have that list of employees or the list of vendors and the financial institution and the law enforcement and everybody that you're going to contact, their names, their contact information, everything printed off, because essentially you're not going to have access to what you need at the time you need it.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Wow, that got really loud. I'll add to that. Tabletop exercises. Raise your hand if you've been. I'm doing audience participation. Have you been through a tabletop exercise where you've sat down and pretended like you had a malware event? Those are some of the most eye-opening things that you can do, in the sense that you say, no, your systems are down. Call your customers. I can't. I don't have a. We'll call your people and get the. I can't. I don't have. Great. It starts talking about out-of-band capabilities. It starts talking about having comm structures pre-planned for those type of events. We treat cybersecurity like it's just tools. It is a lot of things. It's process, it's how we work, it's continuity of operations, it's disaster planning. So there's a lot of that starting to happen, and I would encourage you to participate in a tabletop if you haven't, for sure. The other piece was, in the news 2 days ago, the feds just raided a Chinese POS system company out of Florida directly related to your conversation. So,
Wow. Thank you, guys. Any questions along the way here, folks? Sounds like a good exercise.
it's where you sit down and I have a pre-planned simulation. So my statement's going to be bringing executives in a company to sit down, as well as operational people in that company to sit down and say, simulated, your systems have gone down, right? So when you think of ransomware, it essentially makes it to where all of the endpoints and machines that it can touch and it has purview to in its blast radius aren't usable, right? Their systems don't function. I can't use the programs that are installed. I can't use the things that we depend on daily. And so a tabletop exercise is just a simulation where you force people to go through those thought processes. And what it really does is it makes you realize, man, I could just do this and this would fix that challenge. And then when that one day comes, you have that document, you have those things necessary, and it helps train the muscle fibers, right? That muscle memory of reaction to cyber events, because they're going to happen. We treat this like there's a stopping it all the time. No, it's limiting the damage, it's how we react, it's how quickly we solve it, it's how quickly we continue operations, right? It's how we reduce the outside PR impact of those things, and so all of those things are part of my purview, and tabletops touch on a good majority of it. I think you're a plant, but that's a great question.
Well, the interesting thing to consider with these examples is that, you know, Jim, you'd mentioned people tell you about these things after the fact, but this isn't something that, like you said, preventing a PR incident, Matt, like people don't want to share this information that they've been hacked, considering PR. So again, to Penny's point, these are just the ones that you might know about. And there's how many more that are going to be completely silent that you'll never hear about because heaven forbid you should. You know, it's not good for the business reputation to hear about these things. So just a great point. What, Isaac, you touched on this a little bit, but what can the impact of a cybersecurity incident look like to a business? You know, obviously financially, I think that's probably a bad outcome, but there's reputation and other things too. So does anyone want to speak to that?
I'll go first, sorry. But yeah, I would say that what we're starting to face is if you close your eyes and dream and started a new company tomorrow, a lot of the legacy infrastructural, and I won't dig into it too much, things that got us to where we are today, there are new processes and new models that allow you to be much more security focused in the very beginning and protected. And so I think what we're seeing happening is the insurers are not wanting to pay, right? AIG, you know, you've got Transamerica in July said they're not going to do cyber. Beasley just stopped doing cyber riders from MSPs. You have this huge kind of the financial is on you as a company, right? You're not going to get paid. Your example is a perfect one where the rider had a specific waiver. And so as we see these companies, these insurance companies struggle and these banks struggle with actuarial understanding, like I'm fat and have high blood pressure. I'll die a certain way. Like that's the reality. It's just mathematical. But if you start looking at cyber, there's no barrier to entry. You know, there's nothing saying that this company knows what they're talking about and bringing that protection to you in a lot of ways. And so you have this situation, and I think this perfect storm folding where, and not fear, uncertainty, and doubt, this is just from my experience, but where these companies start failing and their competitors start winning. And then you also have this stigma that exists about cybersecurity. And if you have an incident, you failed. No, it's how you handle it. It's how you respond to it. It's what you did. And customer confidence is going to start tying to that. So I think we're seeing a world where there is a bit of a cliff, and I think the companies that get this and that iterate and start moving, like you don't have to be perfect. You know, let perfect be the enemy of good is not good, right? And so iterating and moving forward, and those companies that are thinking about that probably have a much better path to weather this. It's not the cyber event. It's after that ransomware when your customer base is calling going, why is this down? And you don't even have a way to answer it. Your phones don't function. You have no out-of-band communication. You have no methodology to convince them that you know what you're doing. Now picture this. You have a ransomware event. Hey, customer base, we just had a cybersecurity incident. Out of an abundance of caution, we're taking down these systems. We're going to work through this. We've already called all the critical clients. We've made sure they have their operational technology they need to continue forward. Like those type of responses will be what wins in the end, right? We're all going to be affected by cyber incidents. It's how we respond and how prepared we are. And so I think we're heading towards a situation where this is a bit of a self-solving problem. New people springing up and businesses as competitors will be much more security first, and they'll take the business. And so you'll see this happen both in attrition methodology as well as a business shift towards the ones that get it. So I think we have a real big shift happening. Banking's going to drive a lot of that. The ones taking the losses today are banks and insurers, right? At the end of the day, you have a personal guarantee. How good is that when you don't have a company? It's not going to pay the bank, right? And so these banks are taking massive losses. The feds are trying to struggle with this challenge. You have them, sticking their nose in a lot of things from a regulatory perspective. So I think we're finally grasping at this. If you think of the Industrial Revolution or even automobiles, first automobiles, 1865, seatbelts, 1965. That's 100 years. Look at 100 years of development of technology and what happens if we don't regulate and change some of these things internally. So we're kind of struggling with a brand new technology, and everybody that just jumped in and consumed it is now wrestling with the ramifications of those rapid changes without security. So my opinion anyway.
And this can go a lot of ways and areas, so I don't mean to jump around, but think about the things that everyone is saying on the panel and the people that need to be involved. And it's not just an IT problem, right? You have to involve the various departments within your organization all the way up to the senior level management, to your board. And it's regardless of size. And when we were working with small businesses, where do we start? Talking about a tabletop exercise, shut all your systems down for 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And just start to write down every phone call you get, every issue that you have, 15 minutes, and do it intentionally on your time in your space. You can start at the most simple level. Just turn everything off, believe it or not, for 10 or 15 minutes, and jot down every call you get, and then you can start to build a plan. And that's for the very small business side of it. Certainly that wouldn't work on the larger side.
I got horrified for a second. I was like, I agree with you in principle, but that's terrifying.
But a small business owner says, where do I start? Turn it all off, and you'll start to build your list really quickly. So if a tabletop exercise, when you're now facing larger companies in the middle market, certainly the companies that I deal with, can be 10 million to, let's say, 3 to 500 million. But the smaller businesses that are under that really have no clue. It's our job to help guide them and to start. Where do I start? Turn it all off for 10 or 15 minutes and start to make your list. That's the most, 101 for a small business owner, because again, what we're seeing is small businesses, nonprofits, they're going to become the targets of these situations. Some of the large corporates, the larger entities are putting the right practices in place. Since our insurance provider isn't here, the one thing that I'd want to say is, mirroring their comments, very few of my customers that lose money have recovered from an insurance company. And you're going to continue to see that get worse. But yet when I have an annual review with my clients, and I always say, what's your coverage? I've got fraud coverage.
I'm good.
What does that mean? Let me read it. Send it to me. Do you know what it says? They don't. Well, I know it's good. Well, I know it's not. And not to pick on the insurance guy because he's not here. There's lots of coverage available, but do you have it, and do you know what it is? And you can't wait until after the fact to read it and understand whether you do or you don't. And it's not just cyber coverage. It's not just fraud coverage. What does that mean? Is it internal? Is it external? Is it ACH? Is it wires? Am I covered if I opened the door? If my employee had a simple password, my insurance policy probably is not going to cover me. And it's that level of detail you need to think about and look at.
I thought Isaac wanted to say something before.
Oh, sure.
So there's the short-term impact of your operations being impacted, maybe some reputational things. But I'll take the optimistic side on this one. When a company has an incident, a lot of times one of the impacts is their cybersecurity gets better after it, right? Like they say, okay, well, we have to invest in this. We've already been hit by this once. And that's happening to enough companies right now where they are eventually investing. It really is one of those things where an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So putting in those processes can prevent things, or at least contain them when they happen. But I do think there are, in the long run, for everybody, some positive things that come out of it. A little bit. I agree.
Just in regards to general impacts of a small business cyber event, essentially, first of all, you have to realize, in addition to the money that you may be out, the time that it's going to take to try to recover, to talk to the financial institution, to talk to your IT, to talk to your HR, to talk to all of your customers that have been potentially impacted. is extensive. So the impact in and of itself for a small business can be either overwhelming or devastating if you're not prepared. So this, and I know that Penny had mentioned some of the businesses, 100 million and more. That is very true, but for some of the small businesses, maybe you can't handle a cyber attack of 50,000 or 100,000. Can you recover from that? And those are the things that you have to realize, is that those smaller attacks are also out there. They're occurring every day. And so that's something that you have to be prepared for, and realize that if you're going to pay out because you don't want the bad publicity, what else is that going to affect? Is that going to put your company under because you can't recover? So those are some of the really important impacts to take into consideration.
I'm gonna jump in real quick because I'm putting on my fake insurance guy hat since they're not represented today. The other thing that you don't really often realize as a business is that if you have cyber insurance, that also can make it worse for you sometimes. What I mean by that is, oftentimes if you have cyber insurance, they're going to have their own incident response teams. You're going to have to wait to get in queue for those things. They won't let you restore systems and bring things back up until they've had their ability to gather the forensic evidence they need, and you're waiting. And we had one where an insurer made us wait 7 weeks, right? Like, to get into the response time and do the things. And you start getting into a point where, unless you have out-of-band systems or high availability or some way to spin up your systems outside of the normal infected environment so that you can contain and continue operations, you wind up in a situation where you're just waiting and you're just telling your customers, I can't do anything until the insurer says I'm good. And so you start getting into challenges from the actual insurance policy itself, and they're struggling with this loss. And so what they're doing is teaming up with incident response teams to get a better price, and pre-selecting those so they can make sure that they control their cost in some way, and they're just grabbing at straws to try to overcome this actuarial gap that they have. So
another long-term effect, of course, is a lack of trust. Internally, for people that have been attacked, they feel vulnerable, they feel violated. This goes on from a small person scammed at home to a large company. You lose a sense of security. Maybe it was a sense of false security, but you still lose that sense. But what I think a business needs to focus on, and it was mentioned earlier, is a communications plan. People usually don't lose clients because of an incident. Because, if a store is robbed, if something happens, if there's a fire, people understand, I think, these cybersecurity attacks happen. But if you come out and try and cover it up or try and lie about it, it's going to come out anyway. And then it comes out, and you're not just answering your clients about, hey, we had this break in our security, but we patched it. It's, no, I have an ethical lapse, and I thought it was more important for me to cover my own self than to treat you as an honest human being. So make sure you've got a communications plan, like most people have disaster planning. Know what you're going to say, be honest, be truthful, and you will be able to hold on to a lot of those clients.
And it's interesting that you mention a fire and disaster recovery, because those plans are in place and they're tested. They're tested. You see fire drills all the time. You're walking out of your establishment, your organization, your building, whoever is running that test. They're tested frequently and often. You're more likely to have a cyber attack, ransomware, business email compromise. You're more likely to have one of these negative cyber experiences than you are to have a fire. But yet we do all those other things. We plan it, we test it. Every employee participates. They're required to participate. We need to mirror those disaster recovery plans we have on the IT and cyber side to every single employee, whether you're a small business or large, throughout the organization.
Yeah, and you gave me another point too. This eye, just make sure you know I'm talking to you. We don't stigmatize getting robbed, right? My store got robbed. Is that the business's fault? No, we don't feel that way. But around cybersecurity, we do have a massive stigma, and I think that may be part of that. It just hadn't dawned on me until you said that, so yeah.
Cool. Guys, this is getting pretty deep. I wish I could just take you with me, around me, to go back into the world of cyber. like a night of round table or something like that. It's awesome. So one question that we have for you guys is, how can compliance drive cybersecurity, and what is the relationship between the two? And I asked this question a little bit because if you've noticed in your folders, we have some information about CMMC, which stands for Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. Compliance, a lot of that stuff comes from government. I'm really curious to hear your answers around the relationship between those two things in cybersecurity.
Yeah, so there are a number of things happening here. And by the way, I wanted to mention on this topic, yesterday on the floor of the United States Senate, they were talking about making it illegal to pay ransomware ransoms, right? I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but they were literally talking about it. In terms of the compliance question, so what's happening is a lot of the larger companies and the federal government and some state governments are mandating compliance into their supply chains, right? So one example of this is the DoD, the Department of Defense's Defense Industrial Base, CMMC, right? If you want to be selling into the Defense Industrial Base, or you're one of those companies, you need to meet certain cyber requirements. And you know, the days of like PCI compliance, right, where you just check a few boxes and email something off, like that's in the past. CMMC is much more stringent. There are 5 different levels. You have to, you know, Eric can talk to you more about that if we want, but there is a ton of work necessary, a ton of process and policy that has to be in place and that has to be followed every week, every month, every day. And so I think that that's going to, you know, unfortunately increase business costs in these spaces, but ultimately improve security across all of these companies.
So my title is Senior Director of Security and Compliance, so I think this is kind of in my wheelhouse a little bit. And I'll start by kind of defining a little bit. So security is this attempt to find a gap or a weakness and then put in a compensating control. So all a control is something like, listen, when I go to bed at night, I lock my house. That's a control. When I go to bed at night, I set my alarm. If I'm smart, because I'm stupid, I set my alarm to turn on at midnight every night. Right? And so that is a control. The alarm helps detect the intruder, right? The door stops someone and gives a preventative nature. And so those are defined as controls. And most security frameworks live along protect, detect, identify, right, and respond and recover. And so each of those are types of controls. Compliance is saying, if I say I'm going to lock the door at night, then in some degree of capacitance, I have to prove that I did. And so when you start thinking of the difference in the nature between security and compliance, they're one and the same. They're just different halves of the puzzle. The first one is, I'm going to put all these processes in place, and then the compliance is, I'm going to prove or find some artifact that I put these processes in place and I'm doing them. The reason CMMC is so important is before CMMC in 2016, 2017, the US government tried to approach the Defense Industrial Base, and we're using this because it's probably the most poignant example of compliance entering our world. But they said, hey, self-attest. It's a self-attested model, meaning as a company, you just raised your hand and said, yes, I'm doing these things, I'm good, right? Whereas CMMC is an audited framework. It has someone checking your work and saying, did you gather this? Did you prove and sign the log that you're checking people when they come in your building? Did you prove that you're doing the due diligence on those manufacturers of your POS equipment? And so security and compliance go hand in hand. And they're the halves of, here's the protection I know is good for me and what I'm going to do, and here's me proving I did it. So.
And I couldn't mirror those comments enough. It needs to be treated like cybersecurity needs to be treated like any other business department that gets monitored. It has to be. It's no different than bookkeeping. It has to be the accounting team that you have at your company. Compliance is reviewing that. The cybersecurity has to be included like any other department. It has to be audited. It has to be tested. It's not enough just to do the plan and the training. And that's kind of where I started the conversation. You have to test it, and you have to test it regularly. I can tell you from the banking aspect, and again, financial institutions, insurance companies, we are attacked constantly. Why? That's where the money is. We're just like any other company, just on a larger scale. And have a lot more data and accounts that need to be protected. So we are tested all the time. And I would still argue in our industries it's not enough. It's still not enough in our industries because, again, we're attacked more than any other industries in the country, in the world for that factor. So you have to test these things because we can password protect everything, send out secure emails. But bankers, insurance companies, if you've been on the other side of this, well, what's the password? ABC Bank. I'm not kidding. This is what goes on all the time. So you can build the best process and procedures and then blow it all by putting the most simple password to get into that secure email, and you've just ruined it. You don't think these fraudsters are smarter than that? Of course they are. But yet, even on the side of the banks, the institutions that you're working with, if your banker comes back to you and says, here's the secure email, your password is ABC, or whatever the name of the bank is, this happens all the time, you should push back on your bank and say, what are you doing? Yeah. You've just completely defeated the purpose. And what's in those documents? Your account information, your routing number, your social security, your tax ID number, and this is how they're getting it. They are opening accounts with your personal information as you as a check signer with e-signature, because even those trusted partners, your bank, your insurance company, they've negated their policies, their procedures by giving you the most simple password possible. Push back on this stuff. I know we all want to make it easy and we're moving fast, and there's hundreds of factors we could be talking about today, but they need to be built into that plan, which is why that plan is so critical. The compliance piece has to drive this because it has to be tested.
Yeah, I want to add. Brian Krebs is a security researcher that I'm friends with, and he has this saying. He says, make it easier for users to do the right thing and harder to do the wrong. Right? If we bring it back to my house analogy, turning on the alarm automatically prevents the human failure because I just don't have any other choice. It's going to turn on every night at a certain time. And so when you think about these banks and these systems, it's about setting it up so they can't put in a bad password, or setting it up so they cannot use something that's weak, or setting it up so they have to have MFA and it's automatic and it's right. And so you start getting into these processes, and he and I had some chats before this, and automating those things removes the dum-dums, the humans, right, that fail. And it makes it so that we as humans are guided to do the right thing. Microsoft shouldn't allow us to have an insecure password. Why do they do it? Business, revenue. People complain, right? And so we're seeing an entire vendorship starting to understand and struggle with this, and I think your comment on that is exactly accurate on that. So I get excited.
I'm not going to elaborate a whole lot, but because everything obviously has been indicated here. But there was a couple of different pieces that you can take into consideration as a small business. Is when you're choosing your vendor for your IT security, they can actually test your your employees to see whether or not they're clicking on bad links, or they're clicking on fake emails, or potentially clicking on the links inside of possible business email compromise. Your IT security vendor should be able to give you those options to test your employees without your employees knowing it, okay? Because that's a type of conversation that you want to bring to one of those think tanks or tabletop discussions to say, hey, look, we did this to prepare. Now that we see the results of it, how do we move forward from here?
I think when you're talking compliance about an organization, a company's own internal documents, compliance, or that they get from an outside firm that they're trying to follow is one thing. I would not wait to have state or federal government set the rules that I would comply with, because those rules will be a lowest common denominator that will prevent a cyber attack from 1992. I sat on a panel put together by the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection 2.5 years ago to examine cybersecurity and data breaches and come up with a bunch of ideas that they could present. I don't know whatever happened to that paper. I don't know where it went. It's not acted upon. So we should not have a false sense of security that if some new regulations come down, that that's the gold standard. That might be the very baseline, and that's good if you aren't to that baseline. But you shouldn't think, well, I'm meeting that, I'm compliant with what the government wants, that means I'm going to be safe.
Well, and I think to Isaac's point when he started, and the conversations that we're having within our government yesterday and today as well, these sanctions have always been in place. When you pay that ransom, if you're paying a terrorist entity, which more than likely you are, down depending upon how deep this goes, right? You've already done something that is technically illegal and has been for many, many years. You can't send money to a terrorist organization. You simply cannot, and that's not a new rule. What they're trying to do now is clarify how do you further clarify those rules. It's been a rule from a financial institution side every day that we have to check all kinds of things before we wire transfer money out or an ACH out, always. But now you're talking about a business sending the money, and what are they actually liable to do to check before sending? And that's why, to Isaac's point, the answer here might be you won't be able to send it at all, because how will you know? So clarifying those rules, and I'm trying to make it as 101 as possible, but that's what they have to do, because at the end of the day, when you're paying that ransom, which is why their answer is going to be, you can't pay it at all. Now what do we do?
And I'll add one more thing, in that when you start talking about testing your employees, the normal response is a negative one. It's a, you failed, here's a stigma, you should do better, let's point out the failures. We have to focus on the positives. There's a thing called social proof, right? And it's this concept that if you dropped a human off, being able to speak languages in a foreign country, that within a certain amount of time they would behave like those foreign country people, right? It's this need as humans to be in a herd. And so you have this situation where if we just focus on the 80% that didn't click, and say, you know what, Bob, you didn't click, and Sally, that's great, you guys are amazing, you're my rock stars. The ones that clicked on the phishing link will want to be like the ones that were praised. And so I'd caution to focus on the positive side of those testing results rather than the negative.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. And sorry, I didn't articulate that better.
No.
So kind of moving forward, we have one more question for the group, and then we'll get into some specifics here. But this has kind of been mentioned a little bit, where there's this kind of trade-off between friction and easeability, and Matt, you kind of spoke to that too. So how can a business align cybersecurity and business priorities? You know, the examples of, I don't want to do this because it's painful, it's difficult, it's frustrating, I don't know what to do, but you have to do something, right, to protect yourself. So what's that balance?
I'll tell it just the way I think it is. Finding the right IT companies, finding the right cybersecurity providers that kind of get that understanding, they'll make systems that work at the speed of business with security, right? Starbucks switched to a passwordless methodology, and the reason the CISO was able to get that done wasn't because it was going to be more protection or it was going to reduce risk. It was because it saved them 32 seconds signing in times 10,000 employees. So you start thinking of this, we can deliver security at the speed of business and make it convenient, but it often means getting rid of legacy infrastructure. It often means moving towards modern things. It often means abandoning things you've invested in, and you have this sunk cost fallacy. So I do think that what we're going to see is that, my technicians, I have 1,000 employees, and I can ship them a laptop and it has nothing on it. They open it up and sign in, and instantly they have their two-factor, they have all their applications set up, they have all their security tools, and it can't touch data until it has all those things in place. But I've made the customer experience better. I just drop shipped it from Dell. It got there in 2 days. I don't even have to touch it, bring it in, onboard it, no, automated, 100%.
Is that autopilot?
That's autopilot.
And Windows Hello?
It is, yeah. And so you start seeing these kind of capabilities that allow you to do this at speed. The risk, and this is what I spoke about much earlier, is that a new person starting up gets that right now. You've got infrastructure and things to fight through to get there. And so those are the reasons that you get beat. I mean, the you being the editorial sense of the word. But I would say that, businesses aligning cybersecurity and IT with a good provider, with somebody that can guide them down that path, will win, and they'll be able to protect their people much better. So,
and with these businesses aligning with the cyber, every department within your company, I would challenge you to say, what's your cyber policy for your department, for your team, for your group, depending upon the size of your organization, whether you're small, medium, or large. Every single group, if you have a team of people that report to you, even if you don't necessarily have your own department, if you have one person that reports to you, that business priority should align with cyber, because every single one of those areas within your organization should have a cyber plan. Again, I sound like a broken record. This is not just an IT issue anymore. It never really should have been, but this is not isolated. Every group has to have that cybersecurity plan. What does it look like? What does it include? And it needs to be continually built, refreshed. Remote workers, laptops, phones, what are we all using? What equipment is where, and what policies do we have around that? You could have one remote employee worker that you may not think has access to these things. How do you think they're getting in? When I read some of the more global attacks, not just the pipeline attacks, but our water supply chain is being attacked. Our food supply chain is being attacked. The largest grain producers in our country, the largest meat producers in the world, have had these attacks, these ransomware attacks. This is an act of terrorism that affects our ability to eat and drink and live. So this is a real thing, and how are they getting in? If you read some of these details to some of these cases just from this year, It was a remote worker who doesn't work there anymore, an employee that had remote access. When you talk about the turnover being larger and greater than ever before, how quickly, who is HR turning them off? Is IT turning them off? How quickly does that information happen that my access gets removed? I work for a financial institution, and I have for over 25 years. When we go in once a year, when I say annually isn't enough, and see who has access to what systems. This is not the signature bank I work for right now, but any financial institution that I've worked for. What users have, they've been gone for 10 years, and there's users with access. And you wouldn't think they'd be able to log in? Guess what? They can. It's very, especially when we're talking about systems and softwares and not being required to change passwords and log in after a certain time or get locked out. These are large organizations partnering with other software suppliers. This is really critical, and it doesn't matter if you're small or large, but that policy, that plan is driven by compliance. It has to be, because where is that cleanup? When is it happening? How often is it happening? It doesn't matter what your organization, industry, or size is, it has to happen.
I'll add to that, because you're starting to see, this is a great example of my identity-centric kind of like a modern workplace, right, that we just talked about. You know, if you have one single identity, and I don't want to get into the technical, but have you ever signed in with Facebook? Anybody click sign in with Facebook to something? Raise your hand. Yeah? Okay. That's a model of modern identity. You took some identity from Facebook, they worked with this third-party organization and said, I'm going to prove that that's Matt. Why does that matter? Well, now if you disable John when they leave, in every system, John's disabled. You're not chasing down and forgetting, oh, I didn't go to the bank and change their access. Oh, I didn't go to the, right? And so that's what I mean about simplification can actually help make this easier for us and more defensible. Yeah, great.
That's actually the point I was just going to make, is when an employee leaves, you can't just turn off their access badge to, that they have to swipe to get in or what have you. You have to turn off all of their access to everything. And that's where those policies come into place with who do you need to contact? Who needs to be, in control of those contacts? And it may not just be one person that does everything. It's one person for the IT aspect, one person for the payroll aspect, one person for the VPN access or the, the name badge to clock in. It's whatever the different aspects are, that's the type of thing you need to consider. So if you've got, just take one day and think about every aspect that you walk into, every office that you walk into, that piece is being touched. So if somebody's leaving, intentionally, good or bad terms, either way, you have to make sure that you're shutting off every access that they have to that business.
This to me was the easiest question I saw. I mean, businesses exist to make money and provide services, and if you're going to be shut down with a cyber attack, you can't do either. I mean, it's, again, you put a lock on your door, you have a motion detector by the cashier register. Every business doesn't have to be protected physically like Fort Knox is. And same thing with cybersecurity. Every single business doesn't need the Rolls Royce of cybersecurity. If you're a plumber and maybe you bank electronically, I mean, maybe that's it. I mean, you have to have some. But any business sees a risk, you have to mitigate it. So this one, I mean, they dovetail. Cybersecurity is a business priority.
So humans want to feel safe, right? And I think a great example of a business aligning cyber with their business model is Apple, right? Like Apple has worked really hard to make their devices some of the most secure consumer devices on the planet that you can buy, right? Like if you look at all the people in cyber, a lot of us have Apple devices for a very good reason. And so it's absolutely true, in my view, that adding some cyber into your customer process, right, like making your customers feel safer and your employees, that's really good for business.
Good point. How many people have iPhones? A lot, right? Okay, so we're gonna switch gears just a little bit. We're gonna go into some specifics. So Jim, you're up first. How common are business email compromise scams and are small businesses targeted? And I ask you this question because you, as part of the Better Business Bureau, you interface and speak and deal with a lot of businesses. So I'm really curious to hear your answer here.
Well, and as been alluded to during this whole presentation, very common, and it doesn't matter the size of your business. And some of these business email compromise scams aren't just about money. They can be about employee records or your customer records, and they're getting everything that they have. You know, it could be not the CEO saying, write a $10,000 check, we've got a new plowing service in town. It might be, I'm shopping around for new health insurance, and we need, you know, XYZ records of all our employees. Well, then you send that. I mean, it's everywhere. How many did you say per day you get? 10 to 15?
Easily.
Right. Or in the real estate business, of course, this is huge with closings, and you know, all the electronic closings that happen, and there's the last minute email that goes out and says, oh, that was the incorrect bank routing information for that deposit. This is the correct one. This is happening all over all the time. And small businesses, I mean, real small businesses, we tell them, you know, talk to the person, call them up on the phone. And this also happens usually a big time on Friday afternoons, or if the boss they know is on vacation. So if, again, someone's out there spearfishing, or, you know, and they see that you're on Facebook and you're saying you're in wherever you are, you're in Mexico at an all-inclusive, maybe 10 o'clock that night, there's going to be an emergency email to your accountant saying that this happened and you need this, and, you know, ASAP. So you have to be careful on timing, and you have to watch for language, use of the English language. Actually, a study that was done in 2019 found that 90% of BEC groups were operating out of Nigeria. And this is very difficult, of course, for law enforcement when they're out of the United States. But it happens all the time. Everyone that you know may have an experience with BEC that's that common.
Are the perpetrators, have you heard from businesses that the perpetrators are ever caught? And maybe this will snowball into April, but...
Right, but I do have one thing. I just printed this out. This was a press release from the Eastern District of the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Milwaukee on October 18th. Now, they didn't catch the people behind the BEC, but they have people charged with laundering proceeds. So there were people here that were laundering the money. And what they did is they arrested and they indicted 2 guys, and for each charge of money laundering, they could each serve a maximum 20-year sentence per count. So law enforcement is doing what they can, local law enforcement, the FBI. Again, it's very difficult, so they're looking at some of these avenues. It might not be the people over in Nigeria starting it, but they have to have folks here in the United States who they're working with to make it easier.
May I elaborate?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So there's a couple different pieces there. First of all, in this particular case that he's referencing is actually a federal statute, federal money laundering statute. So those are actually, they're great and they work. We actually now have a Wisconsin state money laundering legislation that was just passed. I believe it was May of 2020. And to your point exactly, a majority of these are happening overseas, but I will tell you there are still options. So first of all, overseas, they're actually getting paid to sit in these call centers and call people in the U.S. That is their job that they do every day. They get paid wages, annual wages, to do that. And that's why we ask people to report. We ask people to report to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, because they're a federal agency. They have more jurisdiction than your local law enforcement. We also ask you to report to the IC3, or the Internet Crime Complaint, or Internet Crime Thank you. And so it's really important to reach out to those people because, again, they have federal regulations, they have federal jurisdiction. So actually, starting back in 2018, they had a couple of task forces that have gone out. That one in 2018 was cyber related, but it was actually more so involving elder financial exploitation and the romance scams that were occurring over the computers. And they actually tracked all the people that were reporting those crimes to the FTC. And once they had enough hits where they had the same phone number or the same email or the same contact information, they actually sent a group of federal investigators to another country where they arrested, I believe it was like 18 or 19 people. And it was like they had caused $3 million worth of elder fraud to people here in the US. Your local law enforcement doesn't have jurisdiction. Their police departments are not sending them out of the state, let alone out of the country, for any type of cyber issues like that. And so that's really why we ask you guys to report. We want you to report to the FTC. We want you to report to IC3 because they have larger jurisdictions than what we have locally. But I will tell you, we are utilizing our new money laundering legislation, not just in Waukesha County, but Milwaukee County. I know that there's some that have already been filed up north. We are trying to do that. And in that regard, it is local, not necessarily local people that are doing the original frauding or defrauding. It's actually the people that are continuing the act, meaning that as part of that legislation, there's a number of pieces to it, but if someone is illegally receiving the proceeds, illegal proceeds, so they know they didn't earn it, they didn't sell a product, or they didn't sell a vehicle or something to receive that money, so they know they received it illegally, we can't do a whole lot with that. But the moment they act upon that, they take those funds and they give them to someone else, or they buy something else with it, knowing that those funds were given to them illegally. They were illegal proceeds. We no longer have to prove that they knew it came from a romance scam or a BEC email or anything like that. We just have to prove that they furthered the act, and then we can actually charge them with the money laundering new statute.
Yeah, the great point about the gentleman that was part of the romance scams I think was caught in another country, but he was mainly brought out because he was flaunting it on Facebook. Like, he was all over Facebook with all his Bugattis it was this gaudy thing, and then they grabbed him in like Abu Dhabi or something like that, or I can't remember where it was, but it was UAE. They grabbed him in UAE. So.
I just wanted to add that anything reported to the BBB we share with the FTC and DADCAP here in Wisconsin and the FBI, so we like to work closely with law enforcement because sometimes people aren't really sure, is this a scam, is this illegal, or is it just a bad business I want to report on? So anytime things come into the BBB, we make sure that we share them with our friends in law enforcement.
That's good to know.
And the feds right now have a policy of not re-victimizing the victims. I mean, that's been in place for about 7-8 years. Yeah, we got an audience question. I love it.
I'm trying to make a note of all the places we're supposed to report to. The Internet Crimes Commission, Washington County, Wisconsin Association of Fraud Investigators.
Yeah.
Is there a one-stop shop to report that gets to all of these important people, or should there be?
There should be. There's not.
There is not.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to clarify for IC3, it's just www.ic3.gov. And I believe it's actually I was just going to say, if you could, Internet Criminal Complaint Center or something like that. It's pretty close. I apologize.
And if you want to pick
a lot
one,
of acronyms.
if you want to pick one, pick that one.
Yes.
We suggest all of the above, but if you want to pick one, pick that one.
Yeah, absolutely. If you are only going to yeah, IC3 is the most important. I would start there. After you've contacted your bank or your financial institution, that is really, first and foremost, that is the first thing you should be doing to limit the loss. Not only that, I mean, I actually teach law enforcement how to investigate financial crimes and that type of thing, and that is the first thing that we tell them, is that when these people come into you, if they have not yet contacted their financial institution, they need to do that while they're standing there with the officer, because that should have been the first call.
And if you think this is happening, it is not.
Right.
If you think your teams are automatically contacting your bank, I promise you, unfortunately, you're wrong. So that's where the educate comes into play. Re-educate. Make sure you're asking your teams as soon as they call you, did you contact the bank?
Thanks, guys. Matt, you're up next. If I can get my computer to check back in. Here we go. Okay. Matt, I don't think I got a question from you. So this would be a great just general add-on. Maybe I'll ask a question then. What is like the top 1, 2, or 3 things someone can leave here with today to go do that's like actionable and tangible?
Get a password manager. Start changing your passwords off of the same password. I like to talk about blast radius in my role. My role is not Senior VP Wisconsin, Senior Director of Security and Compliance. It actually starts at the Senior Director part. But getting a password manager and starting to separate out those passwords so that if you have one system compromised, because it might not just be you, the company might be compromised. They might not have been salting their hashes well. They might have had it implanted, or somebody who's doing rainbow table capabilities. But there are attacks against those in stuff, like Netflix gets hacked, right? They have a breach, their data is compromised, your password's compromised. If you're using the same password everywhere, all I have to do is go to one website called namecheck.com, and I put in your username, and it'll tell me every place you've ever used that username. And now I just set that up in a very simple script to go curl those websites and test passwords. That's it. It takes me 10 seconds. So using a password manager makes it to where if you have one single password compromised, the blast radius is limited to the single compromised password, right? And so if you start thinking about most of your password managers now offer additional protections, that would be my second piece, is start getting into a hardware FIDO token. In security, we have these types of authentication. And so when you hear multi-factor or two-factor, I'm going to try to simplify that a bit. So the first factor is something I know, right? That's a password. So type 1 authentication is something you know. Type 2 authentication is something you have. So when you talk about MFA, it's really talking about 2FA or two-factor, something I know and something I have, right? And so then type 3 is something you are, your eye, your fingerprints, things like that. And so I would say that having multi-factor authentication and a password manager probably reduces the bell curve of your risk, at least in those type of attack vectors. And so I would say the other thing is a lot of people get a password manager and then all they do is store the same password every time, right? So you have to still then use that to make random passwords and take the time to change them. So if I could give anyone any advice, business, personal, otherwise, get a password manager and put a daily reminder to go change one password, to go fix one account. And they make it easy. There's like LastPass has a hunting system that'll look for duplicated passwords. They'll often notify you about a compromised password that they see matches one that you have stored. And so I'd say those are the primary things that you could do is just password manager and MFA as a takeaway today. And then the other would be ask your MSP some of these questions. If you're consuming technology through a technology provider, ask them, can you do a tabletop exercise? Are there multi-factor authentication option available? Do you understand cybersecurity and compliance delineations? You know, those are the type of things where just starting to be a more educated consumer and asking those questions will help you at least understand where your posture sits, right? And so I'd say that. Yes? Yeah, so I mean, obviously, personal cell phone, risk in a business. You often also have your business email on there. You have those things. That is why I usually choose to use an Apple phone. Back to his point is that, Apple's always controlled their market, so you couldn't just drop in malware very easily. But combining personal and business creates its own risk. One of the greatest ones we talked through at CSA this year, back a couple weeks ago in Seattle, was this extortion risk. Where instead of me attacking the company, I'm just going to attack the executive, right? And doing that through their Facebook, through their personal accounts, through the things they've chosen to use, and then extorting them into misreporting earnings, right? And I'm going to make the money off of a stock transaction, not off of an extortion transaction. And so, you're kind of doing that through extortion methodologies. And the short story is, I gave away, when I was at Iconic IT, I was an MSP. We managed about 20,000 endpoints. All my employees, I gave away these YubiKeys. If anybody's not familiar, this is a hardware token, kind of like what the banks would have given you back in the day. And it's a little cryptographic representation of myself. It is a type 2 authentication. It is something I physically have that you have to pry out of my hands before you can attack my accounts. And there's also ways to get around it. But the point is doing those type of things to harden the personal side protected my business. Because I didn't have an MSP employee that got compromised and extorted into doing things because they protected their Facebook. They protected their accounts and their systems. So that's one. I don't know if I've answered your question well. If I haven't, I apologize. A little tangential, but the personal side is very important. And then in that same breath, letting people have BYOD, bring your own device, where they're using their own personal laptop and have all those exposures, is a direct exposure to your business as well, as much as their security posture on that personal device is, right? And so I think you're hitting the core of it, though, is that it is the personal side reflects on the business, and having policies on and teaching and educating and empowering your employees can also harden your business surface structure. Dark Side Ransomware Gang is one of the ransomware gangs that's pretty prevalent. They've shut down a couple times over the last few months, but after the JBS attack. But they had an ad on the dark web for MSP employees, $1 million. We'll pay you $1 million if you will give us access to the MSP systems. Right? So they're starting to look at ways to say, I'll take advantage of the human element of people that work for you to then compromise 700 companies, right? And so my job at Iconic was to limit the blast radius. I wanted a technician in Dallas to only have access to the 9 customers they had access to. And I had to fight upstream for that. Most vendors didn't support it. I couldn't have the structure I needed for that role-based access, the principal least privilege. But the human element is often overlooked, and we think systemically. But I'm going to attack the human every time. It's much easier. So.
Great. Thank you. Penny, why is cybersecurity important in banking? That's a pretty broad stroke question. So if there's anything you want to dive into, and I like the aspect of a takeaway. So if there's anything, I think I know what you're going to say for that, but I would love you to do that. Thank you.
So I think we've covered a lot of this. Why is the bank so important when we're talking about a cybersecurity discussion? Banks didn't used to be included in these panels, and I'm so thankful that SWICKtech includes us in this panel. Hopefully you're already thinking, based on the conversations we've had, as why your financial institution needs to be part of this discussion internally, externally. I can tell you from a takeaway perspective, I think the number one thing I would encourage you is, whatever the cyber plan is, whatever the IT password requirements that you have for your employees, think about your employees that have access to bank and money movement systems differently. April mentioned it as well. Have a different policy or procedure that goes a little deeper for those employees. Have them sign off on it. Have them tested more frequently. Make sure their passwords, dual controls are strong. Those out-of-band authentications, multi-factor authentications that were just talked about. If nothing else, any employee that has access to move money, and first and foremost, identify who they are. It's not just your business online banking users. A lot of the accounting platforms, there's tons of fintechs entering this space, payment solution space, money movement space. Know who your employees are working with, know what they've signed up for, because all it takes is a routing number and account number on the bottom of your check in order to sign up for these services. And you're clicking, I agree to the terms and conditions, and electronically agreeing to things that you as an employee may not be authorized to do, and you as a business owner may not know that that employee did. So there's a lot of layers here, but have a different set of policies, procedures, and expectations for anybody that's working in the payment space. If you're a small business, then it's the bookkeeper. If they're working remote, even higher degree of concern of what PCs, what applications, what computers are they using? Are they logging in from a hotel? Where are they logging in from? Make sure you have that much deeper conversations with employees that have money movement tools. One of the things that we talk about a lot is outside of the cyberspace, if you're working with your folks back at your office, whether it's a CFO, controller, who's ever in charge of the money, bank accounts need to have positive pay services. If you don't know what they are, go back and call your bank, or have the right individual within your company call your bank and ask about positive pay. It's a product that's been around for 30 years. I'm not here to sell you anything. Be aware. Be aware of your risk. Be aware of your liability. As a business, doesn't matter if you're for-profit, nonprofit, small, medium, large, the rules apply to all of the above. You may only have one business day to return an unauthorized or fraudulent payment, depending upon what kind of payment it was, including a check. Check fraud, we can talk about cyber all day long, which we have to be, but check fraud is still the biggest fraudulent tool that's used in this country. Billions of dollars are still transferred via check, and now billions of dollars are lost in check fraud, and you as a business owner are liable. Your bank is not. This is not specific to any bank. Your bank is not liable, you are. Banks have to pay on image. Because of that, the liability shifted from financial institutions to you business owners. Talk about positive pay. It's a fraud protection tool banks offer that helps protect payments, creates alerts, checks data for you every single day. We go into some of the things that you mentioned, these timings. This is real. The amount of requests for payments we get Fridays between 4:45 and 5 p.m. is huge. The day before a holiday, the day after a holiday, these criminals know when to attack. They know when you're not watching. They know when you're not looking. They know when you're not using the tools, process, and procedures that you have built. They create a sense of urgency around holidays and Fridays late in the day. So again, positive pay, it's a bank fraud protection tool. Almost every single financial institution, credit union offers it. It's a product that's been around for 30 years. It's not exciting. Less than 25% of businesses in this country use it. I highly recommend talk to your financial institutions about the fraud protection tools they have to offer.
Show of hands, anybody familiar with Positive Pay already?
Excellent.
That's good. Isaac, you're on deck. What can executives do to prepare the business for a cybersecurity attack? What are some of the tangible things also?
So, we've talked about a ton of this here today. Having a plan that you have access to when all your computer systems are down is very important. Having a list of the people that you need to communicate with, right? Starting with your bank, your cybersecurity provider, your insurance provider, et cetera. Going through and doing the training with your employees with either tabletop exercises, et cetera. Like, these are all things that, we just need to bake into the systems and processes of our businesses really for the next decade here, right? Like we're going to continue to deal with these problems. And then, I think just having a basic understanding of it and knowing who the experts in these areas are. Not all internal IT teams are focused on cyber. A lot of them are focused on applications and services to the business, which is fine. But you should, if you're looking to prepare or you find yourself in an incident, you really do need an expert at that point to help you navigate that, because as you've heard here today, a lot of it gets complicated very quickly.
Is there one takeaway you'd suggest from today?
The printed out list of the things that you need to do should be something that you have. Even if you have cloud, email, or phone system, those are going to be in the future, already are, targets for attack as well, right? Like we're working on a ton of things to protect there as well. So you have to have that backup so that you can actually execute your plan. Otherwise, you got nothing to work with.
Thank you.
And sometimes that's good in escrow, right? Like, one of the things that I think is very effective when you start having those is also having that in escrow, in a sense, where if you have an IT provider, service provider, cybersecurity provider, they can also be part of that plan, right? So some of the extensibility objects that would need to happen can live there, and you just simply have to enact that plan, and so yours gets much shorter sometimes that way.
Okay, April, and we're wrapping up here too. So I think, April, you're the last questions for you. What resources are available to individuals or businesses if they are compromised? And I know we've talked about some of this, like the reporting and things of that nature, but on the legal side, what do you have to say there?
Sorry, there we go. One of the resources is actually at your table, and it's a security guide here for cybersecurity for small business resource guide. There are certainly options here down at the bottom where we've started with the Federal Trade Commission, IC3. They actually have resources on their website. They will actually give you templates of kind of how to start your guides, your policies, your procedures, who you need to be in contact with. Again, your financial institution should be your first call. But beyond that, your local law enforcement, who do you need to be contacting? Do you need to be contacting the FBI based on what it is? You obviously, for a business email compromise, you're not calling the FBI. You're calling your bank first. Okay. And then if you've had a loss, then you're obviously going to contact law enforcement. However, if this is a ransomware attack and your data is being hacked, that's a completely different story. You need to call your bank first, and then you need to get in touch with the FBI. Okay. I know I'm repeating myself, but a lot of people don't do it. And that's where we see the outcome later on. I think the other piece is making sure that with regards to resources is that you have your connections, you have your network of who you need to call in advance. So some of them we had talked about, the IC3, the FTC, whoever it is at your bank. Don't just call your main number, okay? Find out who you handle with your business banking, because this is something that needs to be handled immediately to stop it, okay? You need to have your IT people ready and prepared, off-site IT people, so that they have those pieces ready together for you. So in addition to this, there's certainly other aspects that you can reach out to. The Small Business Administration, they have some resources available to you and kind of how to get started with your cybersecurity process or your plan. So those are just a few. I know I don't want to make us go over here on time, but certainly if you're not sure where to begin, reach out. I'm certain you could reach out to any one of us here on the panel. You can reach out to the resources that are provided in the guide for you. But if you're not sure where to start, please ask the questions. Don't just say, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything. That's not a great plan, okay? So we want to let you know that we're all here as resources for you, and we'll help you get started.
And just to mirror April's comment, did you have a?
Question.
Okay, so just my first question back will be, when you call me, which I still think you should call the bank first, my first question will be, have you notified your IT department, resources, and who are they? And I need to know who they are as well, because I need to know what they're doing in order to know what I'm doing. A lot of people don't call their bank first because what I'm probably going to do is shut you down. But that's what I should do. And if your bank isn't telling you, now I'm considered a fraud expert in the industry, which is part of the reason that I'm thankful to be on the panel. If you're calling your bank branch because that's your banker, they may not be telling you the same advice that I am. But the first question they should ask back to you is, have you contacted your IT resources? Have you notified them? And asking you who they are, because we really do need to work in tandem. Depending upon what the situation is, because they're all very different. But more than likely, the first thing I'm going to do is shut your bank access down, and that's what I should do. The last thing you want to do is when you've been attacked is like, oh, I've got to go out and get my banking done and log into your bank. Please don't, but this is what businesses are doing. And they don't want to call their bank because they know I might shut them down and turn off their access. There's nothing you can do online that the financial institution can't do for you manually. Is it going to be more difficult? Certainly it is. But the last thing in the world you want to do is to log into your bank. And that's what the businesses are doing. This seems so counterintuitive. I promise you it's unfortunate, but they're just going to do this really quick. That's the ignorance that we're seeing, and this is widespread. So just contact your bank. My first question to you will be, did you contact IT? And we should work in tandem, because I don't want to turn you back on until I have something from you, from a partner like a SWICKtech, saying, here's what we've done, here's why we now feel confident you can turn services back on.
What a great panel. I mean, seriously. We're good. 4 minutes before we're fully officially done with the time we had booked. But again, feel free to, if you guys have time, if you can linger and hang out. This has all been recorded too, so all the stuff will be at some point within the coming week or weeks put back out on our YouTube channel also. So thank you so much.